Game overs. What happened when the player ends up not doing well enough to the point where the game decides that you have failed this task, please restart it from the beginning. This was something I was thinking about while I was playing the remaster on Generations, so like Shadow Generations, and how they removed the lives counter. And that was a game that people generally didn't really see the game over screen because it was generally more in the player's favor, but it's one of those things how nowadays I do see people not like the idea of a lives counter, or even in other games that I made earlier where people hated the fact that there was a punishment that required you to redo an entire segment. Nowadays a lot of games will instead use a checkpoint system and everything in order to send you back to a checkpoint. Granted, some games can be less forgiving with the checkpoint system, but it's pretty much a way of just putting you back to where you were, and many have appreciated that Hunter aspect. Even the game we previously played, Final Fantasy IX, the current remaster has a continue option from the main menu that will generally put you back in the last room you entered. It will even skip you to the second phase of the final boss if you were to lose against it, and you will. Whole entire thing, which is just a convenient aspect that many enjoy because they can get back to the action way quicker. There are some games like Tokyo Mirage Sessions that also allow you to just save anywhere, where because you have that ability, that also means punishment isn't that bad for losing because you'll just reload it back to your last save point, which why there's some people who don't like it when games only have save points. You remember stuff about Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix when it got released in the States, people didn't like the fact that it didn't have checkpoints because they didn't like the fact going back to the save points, even though save points were very generous, so getting a game over wasn't like an issue, especially since the game also by default just restarts you in the room you were in, so there wasn't no real major penalty for losing. Games that generally have almost always had a life system, as Mega Man franchise, what one time people really complain about the life system is when it comes to entries such as Mega Man 01, where you can flat out fail a mission and it'll just track it as failed everything, but that's only if you fully quit the mission after running out of lives, so you can technically just keep trying over and over. And Mega Man X8, but that's because people sort of felt like it says it came out so long after, in the middle of the PS2 era, people felt like it shouldn't have a lives counter, let alone the fact that its lives counter can only go up to about 5 lives. But then you always see this complaint for like other entries, like Mega Man 11 that came out afterwards, where people see the more punishing nature as essentially part of classic Mega Man's charm, but these two games will generally get flack for you getting sent back and redoing the entire level when you run out of lives. You also have that when games get re-released, they generally nowadays come with a save state system. With emulation, you'll just use a save state system in order to essentially use as a makeshift checkpoint. In Mega Man Zero game as an example, there's the fact that you can just pretty much spawn a checkpoint wherever you want it to be. So you know those games have a live system, you can pretty much in the re-release just circumvent it by making your own checkpoints and everything. And I've seen people do enjoy having that option in order to just bypass a live system, since there are people who feel like lives are essentially just an outdated mechanic, specifically in the aspect of artificial difficulties, and it's just there to send you back way further after failure, or that it was designed more for the arcade era where each line would be a quarter and everything. So nowadays, we're not in that whole arcade design when it comes to games nowadays, you'll feel like there's no reason for it to exist. You also have many games that have a fail screen, but not exactly a game over per se, like older games. Like for example, FS33 doesn't have a game over per se, it has a fail screen you were to lose in combat, but it can just immediately have you restart the battle, or put you back to the last checkpoint, which is always very close by and everything. Compared to something like Final Fantasies 8 and 9, where in those games, dying means a game over screen, and you are sent back to the menu to reload your save. Like I said, the remaster of Final Fantasy 9 allows you to use a continue option. It's one of those things where a fail screen is not the same thing as getting a full-on game over and being told to go all the way back. I know the Samsung Story 3 doesn't have boss fights that can go on for a while, to where being sent back even by a short checkpoint isn't its own issue because of the fact that some boss fights are like, I went through all that, I gotta do it again. You still have that feeling, but it's not like, oh snap, I gotta go back to earlier in the dungeon, or potentially earlier than that if you forgot to save. Save your games. One that pains me heavily is Gunvolt Chronicles Luminous Avenger X2, where in that game, you have no life system. Getting defeated just sends you back to a checkpoint, with the punishment being essentially your ranking at the end of the level. There is no actual life system per se or anything to really worry about, and you can die as many times as you want. You also have even a new feature that allowed you to heal Copen, the main character, which allowed you to essentially sacrifice your score, but keep yourself alive if you feel like you just want to keep going and not have to redo the whole entire level. But like I said, there was no life system, you get sent back to a checkpoint, and that's about it. That is, unless you're pursuing the game's hard mode, which if you're in for the story, you need to, it's called for the true ending, where they then introduce a lives counter on top of just nerfing the hell out of the character, but beside the point. The life system is now brought back, which means now you have to redo the entire level when it comes to dying and getting a game over. The game over now exists, and it's now something you must overcome when it comes to it. Granted, if you're playing the game nowadays, then once you start hard mode, they will give you 99 lives. It won't be enough. But it's the fact that they try to circumvent the issue that they created, even though by that point, just remove the lives counter, you're going to immediately give the player 99 lives right off the start. You also have Super Mario Odyssey, which instead of a lives counter, instead has the player lose coins upon what would have been a game over or loss of life. Granted, with the Mario Odyssey, you only lose a few amount of coins, so it's never anything that drastic or an issue really when it comes to that whole entire losing the coins, so it's not exactly a harsh penalty, but it is the penalty in there instead of making you redo an entire level. Then you have the roguelikes and roguelites, which are designed around inevitable game over, where the roguelike has you doing different things per playthrough because eventually you will either fail or succeed, so the game over is inevitable. Or the roguelites, where you do keep some aspects of your gameplay in order to improve yourself every run, so game over becomes more welcoming rather than an issue. Or a big example would be the game Hades, being the fact that getting game over sets you back to the hub area, which has new dialogue for you to enjoy, so there are people who welcome the game over just to see what the characters have to say next. That whole entire aspect, on top of the roguelite nature, where some of your attributes will carry over into the next run, so game over is more part of the process. However, the issue then becomes for a different roguelike game, Returnal, where one of the complaints would be that trying to complete a run would take a long while, so getting a game over felt way more punishing and not enjoyable if the run needs to take so long, just to then have everything ripped away from you and restart from scratch. You also have the horror game genre, which generally uses the game over system as a way to instill fear into the player when it becomes the fear of losing progress rather than just the fear of the game itself. Something done to make the player scared of their character dying is to pretty much screw them over for progress. With later Resident Evil titles, whether it be like Resident Evil 4, generally giving you a checkpoint system that makes it to where dying isn't really an issue. Some Resident Evil 4 that also changes difficulty depending on how the player is doing, but go to the entire game over system, while you can die and pretty much have a fail screen, you don't get really punished that much, which continue with more and more entries like Resident Evil 5 and 6 especially, which are chapter-based games, and then Resident Evil 7 does have save points and everything, but people got upset that the save points are a required resource like in earlier Resident Evil titles, so it didn't feel that scary unless you were playing the game's hard mode after beating the game once, which then you had to use a resource, so the fear of losing progress was now back, which many horror games tend to also rely on. The fear that the fear of the game over screen is something you must dread because you want to go back and redo the stuff you already did, as a checkpoint was super handy, it would essentially just erase that whole entire fear since, well, if you checkpointed, might as well go back and do something incredibly stupid since you're going to be punished for it. You have the Souls franchise where ever since Demon Souls for PlayStation 3, death meant that you would lose all your currency, which is also your experience points, so you had to go back to the locale where you died in order to obtain it, so you had to be more careful or just rush right in order to not lose what you had before, the whole entire thing, or it's gone permanently. Granted, the Demon Souls is also more punishing because it also handicapped your health when you died, which is, that's something right there. Hey, you died. Here's less HP so you suffer more. Kind of whole entire idea. But it was a way of pushing the player so there was no actual game over screen in question, unless you want to be a smartass and say that technically the long load times of Demon Souls were essentially your game over screen because you would just be left staring at an image waiting for a game to actually load. An infamous quote that you would generally hear people joke about in the 2010s was from David Cage of Quantic Dream, because Quantic Dream sucks, is the quote, game overs are a failure, the game design. With his particular quote being from an excerpt, he feels like you're making a more narrative game, he feels like having a game over state doesn't really add up. But it sounds like a more action game, then yeah, it makes sense in sense of skill. But if you're going for a narrative, then halting a narrative because the player didn't do the thing you exactly wanted is essentially his complaint, and why he designed games like Heavy Rain and Beyond Two Souls and Detroit Become Human to not exactly have a game over state, but instead just lead to alternate branching pathways. And this quote was relentlessly mocked since people generally thought he was tripping to everything. He wasn't, but also the amount of work needed in order to even do what he even says, which, if you played his games, they don't necessarily live up to the kind of major way he pretty much hypes this up for his games, because, well, there's gotta be a limit somewhere in development budget and scale when it comes to this whole entire aspect of everything now has to have a good or bad outcome, and sometimes it just feels like the bad outcome is more trivial than anything else, not anything actually substantial for the narrative. Like using Heavy Rain for example, yeah, there's no game over state per se and the narrative will just keep going, but you also notice some of the faults to the narrative, so it's the fact that 2 out of the 4 playable characters essentially have plot armor because the plot would fall apart if they were to actually die early on, so the game has to make excuses upon excuses for why the characters are either severely injured or aren't dead. That's by all accounts, they really should be. But the other 2 playable characters, who the story doesn't exactly need to go on, have many different ways of dying in the game, so there's more of a danger and threat for them in Heavy Rain, but the other 2 don't really have any sort of death encounter until the actual finale of the game, which pretty much cheapens the entire narrative, where the game has to, like I said, bend over backwards, justify how this death-defying thing didn't kill them somehow. A particular example I'll go into in Heavy Rain is one where Ethan Mars has to decide whether or not to kill this man in order to help find his son Sean. Thing is, if you fail the QTEs, then your punishment is that the guy just throws you out. And it's like, this is a guy who thought Ethan is trying to kill him, which technically based on choices, he is, pulls out a shotgun and tries to kill Ethan in response, and all he does to Ethan is just throw him out of his apartment and call it a day? Like, that's it? It's kind of one entire thing where, yeah, the story kept going, but just feels like it's just an unsatisfying payoff for a failure state. On the flip side, you have other games that are pretty much known for their game overs. Like, off the top of my head, would be Dead Space 2 and how many different ways Isaac can die in that game that something developers essentially revel in. Or maybe something like Tomb Raider franchise, where the way Lara dies in those games are very noted as something people generally look forward to. I remember when Tomb Raider reboot game came out, people were curious how to get the massive game overs across everything, and people generally liked what they did. It was one of those things where seeing the main character fail is something people also see with a franchise and go, how will they handle this or that kind of thing. Or even just the Batman Arkham series, where the villains always have some sort of comment towards Batman, but it's shown in a first-person shot, so it looks like they're talking to the player in order to make some sort of smack-talking comment towards the whole entire player's experience, everything. It's one of those unique ways of doing a game over, where it's just, hey, here are the villains getting their 2 cents now that they've effectively won, which is also a cool what-if scenario of how would they feel if they won. An interesting way to use a game over is Demolition Man for the 3DO. I don't think we put a 3DO example here, but here we go. We're in the game's game over screens. Sylvester Stallone, in character, essentially insults the player. It's one of those things where, yeah, there's not a whole lot for him to say, but you're having the main character of the game smack talk the player. What more do you need on top of the fact that many people just enjoy it just because it is the Sylvester Stallone reprising his role just to say you suck? And the novelty is that is a lot of people enjoy that just based on that fact.
Good, but I would say it's horrible yet terrible. Ugly yet disgusting. You suck.
Another cool game over screen is the one for the Bayonetta franchise, where you have the game over screen where it prompts you to continue, but it's the fact that selecting no actually shows you what happens to the Umbran Witches, where something in the game constantly tells you that if the Umbran Witch dies, her soul is essentially dragged to hell and tortured for eternity, with the game over screen effectively showing you that happening if you were to just select no, which is one of those things of, hey, here's a detail that they constantly mention, and now here you actually seeing it happen. The game overs in Metal Gear Solid are very well known, and also often parodied, because of one entire thing where Snake screams out his death and a character tries to desperately get in contact with him. But the one I want to highlight specifically is from Metal Gear 4 Guns to the Patriots, not just because of how dramatic it is, not just because of the death scream, not just because there's technically 2 different variants when you go back to a certain locale from a previous entry so music changes, but just for the fact that the game over screen constantly shows you the more recent images happen in the game, as if life is flashing through Snake's eyes, and it constantly keeps updating throughout the game as you see more and more cutscenes of it, which is just a super cool detail that I know MGS1 is the classic what people think about, or MGS2 is the one that destroyed their brains, but Guns of the Patriots for me has to be the coolest use of it when it comes to the visuals, everything going on with the game over.
Snake, you can't die! No! Snake! Snake!
What's wrong with you?
Snake! What did you just do? Have you lost your mind? Oh no! What are we gonna do now, Snake?
You also have the boss runbacks, the hunter aspect, where not every game will set you back, like I said, right near the boss, so you have to make a trek back to the boss, survive the trek or do well enough, and then fight the boss itself. With this also having been a more divisive point recently because of Hollow Knight's Silk Song and its runbacks that at most can be like 30 seconds. But the whole entire aspect where some feel like it asks a challenge where I need to go back to the boss without getting too injured or just not care and essentially get there weakened and go, oh, it anyway, come at me. Kind of whole entire aspect where it adds to the difficulty and makes the game over for some people a bit more annoying now to full fight the boss again, but then have to also get to the boss. Another one is Devil May Cry 3 Special Edition, which will prompt you to use a yellow orb like in the OG game, or a gold orb that was added into the re-release. The yellow orb revives you outside the room where you died, and essentially acts as a life system where running out of yellow orbs will make you restart the entire mission. The gold orb will instead, when you die, put you back before the room you were in, but using a gold orb will revive you on the spot, putting you at an advantage. And if you ask anyone about this system, they will always say pick the gold orb, since it is way more forgiving, and if you do use the gold orb itself, it will just pretty much revive you on the spot, full HP, making it so you can have an easier time with the boss, as opposed to potentially punishing you and make you redo the entire mission and essentially have no progress really being made. The last point I want to make is how earlier Final Fantasy games would generally just have your party was annihilated text on the screen when you got a game over for booting you back to the main menu. It wasn't until around the PS1 era where they had dedicated game over screens. In Final Fantasy VIII's case, it had Prelude playing for some reason, the game over screen. I don't know. But either way, it's the fact that they had more dedicated game over screens to really highlight the fact that the heroes had lost. Now cut to more recent Final Fantasy titles where because they want to get you back to the action quickly, it just kind of has the text game over on the screen. Sometimes just on the screen itself and not even to a dedicated screen, but in this case, if I was in Rebirth, it's just a text game over that asks you to retry or go to the title screen. I'm surprised that the waves are blue and not at least green to match the live stream or anything. Like, compare that to the Final Fantasy VII game over screen from the original, and it's just night and day difference of the kind of effort put into that one-time game over screen. But like I said, Rebirth wants to kind of just get back into the action quickly. Also add this while I'm at it, also RPGs where it's game over if the main character dies, where people don't like that, including me, since it means several things, such as enemies can't be designed to be aggressive towards the main character, can be unfair, or it could just still feel unfair if the enemy gets lucky and just obliterate the main character, whether it could be an ability that insta-kills them, or if it becomes a persona, they just get a one more and just double up because of the main character, which means the enemies are smart for doing it, but it's also frustrating when it happens since it feels like the game over is essentially out of the player's control. And I can see why they do it, since in the case of Personas 3, 4, and 5, the main character is more powerful than the rest of their party members thanks to the wild card, but that doesn't exactly make the frustration of, oh, the main character died and restart the entire scenario any less frustrating just because the main character is more powerful than the rest of their teammates. I lied, I'm gonna mention one more. Chrono Trigger and the Day of Lavos. Chrono Trigger, from the get-go, is a game that's whole premise involves trying to prevent an apocalypse scenario from happening, with the apocalypse scenario being the thing that's supposed to happen according to history. And what's really cool is that if you were to fight such your enemy Lavos and everything on the Day of Lavos and fail to win, if you get a game over in that scenario, they actually play out the entire apocalyptic scenario specifically under those circumstances. You get to see just how horrifying a Day of Lavos actually is, on top of the fact of you dying to Lavos and failing to prevent it. They make you feel how bad it is to fail against Lavos in that game. So I just want to talk about the whole topic of game overs, and generally just start with the idea of how there are people who feel like lives are an outdated mechanic, but also depends on the game, because I don't really see people complain about lives because of classic Mega Man like Mega Man 11, and they probably won't have much of an issue when Mega Man Dual Overdrive comes out in 2027. Many announced that game really early, kind of one entire aspect, and this was the fact that certain genres use game overs in their own different sense, like how horror games really use it for fear of the player, but like I said, there's also several horror games nowadays that will just use checkpoint system. That means that there's no reason to be afraid of the enemies, because they're not really going to lose anything if they really take you out. You also have one-take RPGs, where some RPGs have the one-turn multi-phase boss fights, and yeah, I mentioned Final Fantasy IX Remaster lets you just skip to the final phase, final boss if you die, but it is one of those weird aspects where, you know, it's designed for you to go through both phases of the fight back to back, so just being able to skip one of them is kind of weird. I've seen people complain about Toy Story 3 having some long boss fights that have multiple phases, and complain that the phase is going for so long that to redo both phases if you die feels unfair, but that's part of the challenge. That's the whole point of the scenario kind of aspect, so it makes sense that they make you redo both. So for not having that, it kind of feels weird in that aspect. So what I gotta say about it, go out there, play games, we're not have pushing game overs, or not. Or maybe some game overs you enjoy, think it's just really cool design with a one-turn aspect. That's one-turn aspect we'll talk about. Alrighty then, good day.